August 25, 1944, St. Lo, France. Sergeant James Thompson stood beside a line of idling trucks that stretched past the shattered church tower and down the chalky road cut by bulldozers through the rubble. He wiped diesel grit from his eyelids and felt the road shake under his boots as another 3-ton GMC rolled forward to the loading dock. He could still smell the wet plaster and burned timber that told the story of July, when American artillery had pounded a corridor through the German lines and the town had been hit again and again. The air at first light was cool, but the engine heat rose around his knees, and the scent of raw gasoline from the jerrycans bit the back of his throat. He checked the chains that held 60 empty 5-gallon cans to the rack and counted off the rows to be sure the number matched the loading ticket. Around him, men from his truck company moved with the same quiet haste he felt in his chest. They had slept 4 hours on canvas cots thrown under their vehicles to keep off the dew. He glanced at the chalk on his door. Red ball. Chartres. Priority. No stops except for breakdown or fire. A corporal from the motor pool leaned in and said that the route markers were up all the way to Dreux, and that military police would clear civilian traffic from the main road. Thompson nodded and climbed into the cab. He looked through the cracked windshield at a curious world where everything felt narrowed to a task. Fuel first, eat later, sleep somewhere along the verge if the convoy halted. He tapped the photo tucked into the sun visor and settled his hands on the wheel, rough with grease and sun. At the signal, he let the clutch out, and the truck moved forward into the day. Behind the line of trucks and beyond the sight of a single driver, the army that demanded this fuel had burst free of Normandy and was surging across France with a speed that alarmed its own logisticians. In the last week of August, the American army had advanced more than 300 miles against a retreating enemy that was still dangerous, but no longer able to hold static lines west of the Seine. Third Army under Lieutenant General George S. Patton had raced from Avranches to Le Mans and then swung east with a hunger for movement that could be measured in gasoline and motor oil. Patton later wrote that his men could eat their belts, but his tanks had to have gas. The sentence was plain, and the arithmetic was plainer still. An M4 tank drank about 2 gallons per mile on the road, and a pursuit that covered 50 miles for a battalion demanded tens of thousands of gallons as a day-to-day minimum. Rail lines behind the front were still twisted from demolition. Ports that could bring in bulk fuel were only beginning to function at Cherbourg and along the beaches. Airlift was far too small to matter for fuel. That left motor transport, the trucks that some enemy staff, officers had once described with a mixture of contempt and curiosity as the American habit of solving every problem with a new engine and a new road. German officers who had grown up in an army that loved rail timetables had mocked the way Americans carried garages with them and built depots inside wheat fields. But their words were now meeting the hard edge of events. In late August, the communications zone, the rear service that ran depots and pipelines and repair parks, declared a dedicated truck highway called the Red Ball Express. The route ran from the beaches and depots near St. Lo to forward dumps around Chartres and beyond. It used one road for outbound loaded convoys and a parallel road for empty returns. At peak, it marshaled about 6,000 trucks, most of them driven by African-American soldiers in segregated companies who worked 12 to 14-hour shifts with eyes that burned and nerves that learned to read dust and metal and weather. The goal was simple and large. 12,000 tons per day to the forward armies, with the biggest share to Patton, who was pressing toward the Meuse and the Moselle and the line of the Rhine beyond. Thompson set the speed in second gear and watched the convoy form into a single ribbon over the low hills. He had driven this road only twice, and both times at night. Now in daylight, he saw what the darkness had hidden. The roadside was a scatter of wreckage from July that bulldozers had pushed into ditches. Abandoned German half-tracks sat burned out with wheels gone and tracks cut. There were dead hedges where fire had run, and there were plow furrows where farmers had pushed earth back over shell holes so the road would not throw axles or break springs. Military police waved them through crossroads with white gloves that flashed like birds. He heard his engine climb and settle, and he listened for new sounds that would warn of a loose belt or a cracked manifold. The drive was a kind of meditation that rode on fear and skill. He kept 2 truck lengths to the vehicle ahead. He watched for the red discs painted on road signs that told him he was still on the right route. He picked out the smoke of a cook fire in a field, and the flash of a river beyond a poplar line, and the smell of cut hay rising from wagons that pulled back to let the column pass. When the first rest halt came mid-morning, he stretched his legs and checked the chain on his spare, and put his hand on the sidewall of the right rear tire where the tread had taken a nail the day before, and the patch held. He ate 2 crackers and a piece of cheese, and drank warm water from his canteen, and looked down the file of trucks that ran past the bend. He could not see the end. A lieutenant came by in a jeep and shouted that the bridge at Mortain was safe, and that the damaged span beyond would take single-lane traffic at a crawl. Thompson slid back into the seat and felt the weight of the fuel under his ribs even though his cans were still empty. Knew what they would carry by nightfall. Gas, oil, grease. Blood if a tire blew at speed, or a driver nodded off and drifted into a culvert. He turned the key again, and the big 6-cylinder coughed and took hold. The convoy moved. While individual drivers watched the next bumper and the next hill, the oversight map at the rear recorded numbers that grew into a story of scale. The Red Ball Express adopted a simple discipline. Vehicles wore a red circle over white that marked convoy priority. There would be no detours into nearby towns, no civilian stops, no side errands for officers. Convoys traveled in serials of 50 to 80 trucks, with pace set by an experienced lead driver and enforced by jeeps at the front and rear. Most truck companies were staffed at 300 men and more than 70 vehicles. By the second week, the system was moving more than 10,000 tons per day to the armies, and on some days higher. A gallon of gasoline weighed a little more than 6 pounds, so a single day could push 3 million gallons forward when every bridge held and every driver kept the line. The burden fell hardest on maintenance and on the men who rode the cab. Road dust mixed with oil and clogged carburetors and air cleaners. Brakes heated on the long hills into the Ure Valley. Tires blew out under heat and load and shortage of new stock. Units rotated tires from deadline trucks to keep moving stock on the road. Motor pools raided their own boneyards for shocks and leaf springs. The men who drove slept on ground pads rolled out under the bumper or against the back tire for windbreak. They ran without headlights at night, guided by the faint glow of a blacked-out taillight on the truck ahead. Most of the drivers were young, and many were black soldiers from the South and the Midwest who had learned to keep their heads down in 2 worlds. They drove because that was the job offered, and they learned to be very good at it because not being good meant a jackknifed trailer on a narrow bridge or a gear stuck on an incline with a line of tanks waiting behind them. Enemy action was rare on the trunk routes, but danger still lived in the air. German fighter bombers sometimes probed for targets, and there were artillery harassing fires on the fringes of the routes, and there were mines on turnouts that had not been swept. The most common enemy was speed and fatigue. Reports to the communications zone noted that coffee consumption climbed, that drivers fell asleep with hands on the wheel, that units cut radio chatter to essentials so a sleepy man could keep a single voice in his ear that told him that the road was clear and that the bridge ahead was open. Across the front that these convoys fed, a pursuit was writing its own numbers. Third Army captured more than 100,000 prisoners in August. By early September, American armored divisions were reaching the Meuse in places that German planners had hoped to hold much later. The enemy backhand, blow that Berlin wanted, could not form when fuel and shells did not arrive at the right place and time. German commanders who had once sneered at American motor pools now warned each other about the rolling depots that followed American spearheads and seemed to push supply into the very roadbeds. Thompson reached the forward dump near Chartres just before sunset, the sky pale and broad and the air warmer than he liked. He pulled into the lane assigned to his company and rolled to a stop where a sergeant with a clipboard checked tailgates and rack counts. He and his assistant unhooked the chains and swung the racks down with a clatter, and the empty cans passed from hand to hand into a heap that would be filled at once. In minutes, a fuel detail began to fill the jerrycans from a tanker that smelled like a refinery. He flexed his fingers and checked his headlamps to be sure the blackout plates were in place. A captain walked the row with a map board, pointing drivers to new destinations that tracked the fast-moving front. The orders for this serial were simple. Load now and push into the night for a dump near Reims that would feed Third Army units crowding east. A mess line had been set up, and he took a bowl of stew and a cup of black coffee and ate with the tin warmed by his hands. A driver from another company leaned over and said that Patton had taken Reims already and was pushing toward Verdun, and that there were rumors of a river crossing beyond. Another said the Germans had blown bridges and pulled back toward the Moselle, but that the pullback was ragged and that American columns were outpacing their maps. Thompson listened and said little. He had learned that stories grew in the back of trucks, and that the only part that mattered was the part that told him which road he would take and where he would stop. He felt a small pride when he looked down the lane and saw that his racks were loaded full and the caps were tight and the chains had been set correctly. He scraped the last stew from his bowl and stood. He had 9 hours before dawn and 200 miles to drive. He closed the cab door and looked once at the sky. In another life, he would have counted the stars. The convoy rolled east under blackout, and the journey became a world of sound and feel. He listened for the faint growl of the truck ahead and shaped his speed by it. He watched the tiny slit of red that showed where the blackout mask let a crumb of light escape from the tail of the lead truck. He felt the slats of the bridge decking under his tires and counted the beats that told him the span was long or short. Sometimes he could smell a river before he knew he was near it. Occasionally, he saw a flash on the horizon that told him that a town was burning or that an ammunition dump had cooked off under fire. At one halt, he climbed down and stood in the quiet and heard frogs in a ditch. He grinned at the small human sound of a driver 2 trucks back who had begun to sing under his breath. The night felt like a held breath, and he thought of the first time he had learned to double clutch without looking at the gear lever, and of the first time he had backed a loaded truck between 2 trees without scraping bark. He thought of the motor pool corporal who had told him that the truck did not care if the driver was tired or angry or proud. It only cared for fuel and oil and hands that kept it between the ditches. He thought of the words that drifted through the depot, words about German officers who had once joked that Americans could not keep their vehicles running past a week without a factory beside them. He looked down the ribbon of trucks and felt that the answer to that joke was a river of engines that linked beach to front and a night road that did not end. As Thompson crossed into Champagne country, the broader tide of events turned his individual miles into a campaign map that spread across Europe. In the last days of August and the first days of September, American and British armies liberated Paris and swung north and east against an enemy that had left more than 200,000 men and vast stores of equipment on the wrong side of a ring of encirclement in Normandy. The retreat across the Seine had been chaotic. Bridges bombed, ferries sunk, columns scattered by fighter bombers that raked roads with fire. The Third Army made the most of the confusion by keeping pressure on every crossing and every road junction south of the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army. Supply now decided where the pressure could be applied. The Red Ball Express began to resemble a second army that moved in parallel to the combat units. Depots leapfrogged forward. Temporary pipelines crept across fields and under culverts toward new fuel points. Engineer units laid prefabricated bridge spans to keep heavy loads moving. Reports from German staff officers captured in September included grudging assessments of the American ability to build a road where there was none and carry a warehouse on wheels. Major General Friedrich von Mellenthin wrote later that American supply was lavish and flexible, and that it could correct mistakes through abundance faster than the German system could correct sound plans with too little fuel. The numbers that underwrote such judgments were blunt. By mid-September, the Red Ball Express had moved upwards of 100,000 tons of fuel, rations, and ammunition since it began on August 25th. The truck count each day could approach 6,000 when every company was in the traces. For Patton, that flow translated into the ability to push divisions to the Moselle and probe for crossings while rotating other units for rest and refit. When the flow faltered, he had to halt. When it grew, he could sprint. In the night, a single driver felt the burden only as hands on a wheel. In the morning, the news sheets at the depot turned that burden into arrows that grew longer on the map. Just before dawn, Thompson saw the pale line of the east growing over the fields and felt the relief of sight. As the convoy entered a rest field outside Reims, the columns of the cathedral lifted above the low roofs like fingers held up to test the wind. American flags hung from windows where the city had been liberated days earlier. He pulled into a row marked for fuel and set his brakes and felt his hands loosen. The men who took his jerrycans had worked all night and would work through the day. He wanted sleep so badly that his eyes hurt, but the officer on the line was calling for volunteers to turn around at once with empty racks and pick up another load at the rear dump. He looked at the faces around him and saw the same tired math. He raised his hand and heard his own voice say that he would go. He ate a piece of bread and took a swallow from a tin cup of coffee and climbed back in. As he drove west into the light, he thought of the distance he had traveled and of the men who were now pouring his fuel into tanks and half-tracks and jeeps that would move at once. He thought of rivers ahead that he had known as names on a school map. He thought of the Rhine and of what it would take to reach it. He eased the truck onto the open road and felt the engine rise again. Behind him, the planners who watched the flow were already looking past Reims to Verdun, to the Meuse and the crossings that would be needed when Patton forced the Moselle bend at places like Nancy and Metz. The chase toward the Rhine would depend on the same twin facts that had governed every mile since the Red Ball began: fuel and time. The German army was falling back on shorter lines and stronger river barriers. The enemy still had skill and could form counterattacks when fuel and a few intact bridges allowed. The American answer lay in keeping the road army fed. German officers who had once claimed that American motor pools were clumsy and that soldiers who carried tools could not fight were now reading reports that warned of a new kind of pressure. It was not only steel and shells, it was motion. It was trucks arriving at dawn with tanks close behind them. It was black coffee and warm engines and drivers who learned roads by heart and slept by the wheel when the column stopped. It was the harnessing of 6,000 vehicles and tens of thousands of men to a single purpose, a pursuit that would not let go. In that larger frame, a single driver was a small thing, but the road made him the necessary small thing, without which maps were only paper. The night after Rheims broke into a gray morning along a road that rose and fell through chalk and vines, and Sergeant James Thompson felt the cab hum through his bones as if the engine had become a second pulse. He had promised himself he would sleep on the return leg, but the call for another immediate turn kept him awake and in the line. And now the day stretched ahead with the same measured chore that had already begun to feel like a personal geography. He kept the truck steady at the convoy speed, listened to the idle chatter on the company net that served as a guard against sleep, and watched the red discs that marked the route. A military police team stood at a crossroads north of Epernay, with white gloves that flashed like gulls as they waved the column through and held a cluster of local carts in the ditch until the tail passed. He registered the smell of must from underground cellars, and then the flat, clean stink of a river before the road bent toward a crossed bridge. He had learned to read the column by sound and distance rather than sight, so when the lead trucks began to climb, he felt the pull reach him several minutes later and downshifted in time to keep from losing the pace. The heat built up in the cab sooner than he wanted, and by noon his shirt clung to his back and his fingers were black with a mix of grease and road dust that sank into the crease around each nail. He did not think in large terms when he drove. He thought in gears and in wheel ruts and in the habit of checking the water can before each halt and the fan belt at each turn around. Yet small signs carried the shape of the war to him. More French flags in the windows. More liberated towns where boys kicked a ball in the square while the convoy slid by. More wrecked German equipment pulled to the side and stripped down to the last useful bolt. At the forward dump, an officer told him that the racks would go straight on toward Verdun and that the field cooks would bring stew to the trucks rather than pull the men off the line, since the request from Third Army had come in heavy and urgent. He nodded, took the bowl, ate fast, signed the load board, and moved out again. The day narrowed to the rim of his hood and the steady shuffle of vehicles. When the sun fell, he cracked the side window to bring in cooler air and the scent of damp earth. He rubbed the edge of the photo in his visor and told himself that the next halt would mean 10 minutes with his eyes closed. The halt did not come when he wanted it. He found himself counting heartbeats to keep time and then counting fence posts for a new rhythm, a small trick that one of the older drivers had taught him, a way to keep the mind engaged so the hands did not float. When the radio spoke at last to announce a rest field near Bar-le-Duc, he felt the wave of relief pass down the line in the way the trucks eased off the throttle. He pulled onto the grass, set the brake, and slid down. He did not sleep. He walked the length of the truck with a lantern and checked the lugs and the springs and the sidewalls and the clamps on the racks. Only when the light showed him nothing that needed his hand did he climb into the back and fold his jacket under his head. He was asleep between one breath and the next. The broader line on the map that his single truck helped draw had shifted east in the days after Paris fell back into French hands, with Third Army pushing toward the Meuse and then toward the Moselle in a sequence of moves that had the simple logic of speed and the hard physics of supply. On the 2nd of September, the pursuit that had blown through the Seine river line met a limit that had nothing to do with enemy fire. Gasoline stocks in the forward dumps fell to a level that forced command to choose between armies, and the Supreme Commander prioritized the Northern Thrust that would soon be known for a bold airborne plan, while telling the Southern Thrust to pause and husband its stocks. Bradley wrote after the war that the Army had raced out from its railheads like a man who ran out of his shadow, and that for a time there were more wheels than full tanks. Patton wrote on the 3rd that his men were halted for lack of gas, and that it was the first time he had felt more tired than angry. The numbers on the day sheets were cold facts. Third Army needed about 400,000 gallons each day to keep its armored divisions in motion with normal contact. A major push could demand twice that amount. The Red Ball Express, which had opened on the 25th of August, was climbing toward a flow near or above 12,000 tons per day of all classes of supply when bridges held and roads did not choke. A gallon weighed a little more than 6 pounds, which turned the daily forward movement of fuel alone into something like 3 million pounds. The route used 2 major roads, one for loaded trucks and one for the empties that returned, and it relied on a web of military police traffic control, engineer patchwork on bridges and culverts, and a strict rule that marked signs with red discs and cut off civilian traffic. By the first week of September, a paper by the Service Command noted that 3 of 4 drivers on the routes were black soldiers, that the work rate was running at 12 hours or more each day for most drivers, and that the maintenance tail had begun to break parts faster than the depots could replace them. Units robbed tires from vehicles that had been written off. Old parts were cleaned and ground and returned to duty. A chain of company and battalion motor pools set up under trees and in farmyards to keep the line moving, and the recovery teams that dragged broken trucks out of the stream worked with the stubborn pride of men who knew that one dead vehicle in the wrong spot could cost an entire serial an hour. German staff officers who had long placed faith in rails and river barges watched this moving road with a mixture of contempt and alarm. Later writings by officers like von Mellenthin gave the contempt and the alarm clear words. He said that American supply was lavish, that the United States could correct mistakes with volume, and that an army that carried its motor pool with it could move faster than theory had allowed. The contempt had come earlier in the war when German observers saw American columns surrounded by tool trucks and spare tires and assumed that such a train would drown in its own needs. The alarm came now when they learned that the train could float. Thompson felt the pause near the Moselle as a change in tempo rather than as free time. The orders that came down to his company in the first days of September combined a push to stock forward dumps, with a new pattern of short legs from depot to rail spur and back again. It meant more turns and more wear and less sleep, since the Army would use the lull in forward movement to build stock near the river crossings for the next surge. He learned the names of places he had known only from a school map: Verdun, Saint-Mihiel, Pont-à-Mousson, Nancy. He learned the smell of the Moselle by night, a cool presence under bridge timbers. He learned to eat at odd hours and to drink water, even when he felt too tired to think of it. On a night run north of Commercy, a jeep raced past with its hood up and 2 men in the back waving the convoy to close up. Fighters had been seen in the late afternoon and alerts were still out. The threat did not come, but the thought of it lifted his heart rate for the next hour. When at last his serial halted in a dark field, he slid off the seat and bent over at the waist until the pounding in his ears slowed. He could feel the fine grit on his teeth and the ache in his wrists from the constant correction that kept the truck between ditches. He lifted the hood and ran his hand over the fan belt. The belt felt glassy and hot. It could last, but he did not trust it for another full run. At dawn, he found the company motor pool and traded the belt for a new one from a sergeant, who asked for two of his older spare bolts in exchange. He liked the way such trades solved small problems. He liked the way the motor pool men knew that a driver who asked for help had not done so lightly. In the afternoon, he helped a younger driver change a tire. The kid had burned his hands on the lug wrench and looked like he might fall asleep where he stood. Thompson asked him to sit and drink water and handed him a rag and told him to keep his hands on the rag for a while to shake out the sting. He thought of how strange it felt to be the one who told someone else to slow down for a minute. He was 23 years old and felt ancient in that moment. At sunset, he checked his fuel racks, handed his load sheet to the lieutenant, and rolled out again. The sky over the river showed the last smear of light. The road felt known, and that brought comfort and danger. He spoke to himself in a steady voice to keep the head clear. The high view that explained why he ran so hard inside a pause carried figures and dates that would shape the rest of the month. Third Army forced crossings of the Moselle at places like Dieulouard and Arneville between the 5th and the 10th, and fought to break bridgeheads, while German defenders used the forts around Metz to channel attacks and buy time. The Army could not ignore the way fuel shaped options. On the 11th, Bradley told Patton that gasoline allocations would be cut to shift weight north to the plan that would soon drop airborne divisions in Holland. On the 13th, Patton wrote that he had enough fuel for one more hard blow and that he would take it. The blow came in the crossings, and the days that followed became a mix of defensive stands and pushes that depended on what the trucks delivered at dawn. The Red Ball Express reached a daily peak on the 14th at about 12,400 tons moved forward, a figure that turned into artillery rounds that found their way to gun lines near Nancy and into tank battalions that went north to meet counterattacks and into ration dumps that kept men on their feet in rain that began to gather with the change of season. By the middle of the month, the route had carried more than 100,000 tons since its start, and would carry hundreds of thousands more before it shut down in November, when ports and rails and pipelines could take over the burden. Service reports listed more than 6,000 trucks available on good days and close to 23,000 drivers and mechanics and traffic men and dispatchers at work. About 3 of 4 drivers were black soldiers from units that had been segregated since the first day of their service. Men who found themselves praised for speed and cursed for breakdowns, and then told at the end of a shift that the nearest cafe was closed to them. Many commanders in the rear began to say out loud what the road had already proved, that these men were the reason the lines on the map kept moving, that the old sneers about who could do what under pressure were lies. German commanders, reading captured reports and intercepts, and watching through field glasses as American armored divisions showed up with fuel and ammunition after weather had grounded the air, gave their own verdict in their war diaries. Staff officers who had once joked that Americans were soft and that their mechanics and cooks had replaced their infantry now wrote that the American Road Army might be the most decisive factor west of the Rhine. The change in judgment had a clear cause. When a nation can put 6,000 trucks on 2 roads and keep them moving night and day for weeks, it can pull a battle line forward faster than a defender can shift reserves. Thompson never saw that sentence. He lived its truth each time he rolled out of a field at dusk and pointed his hood into the dark. By the 3rd week of September, the days had shortened, and the road surfaces stayed damp until noon, leaving the trucks glazed with a fine film that stuck to every hinge and wire. Sergeant James Thompson woke before dawn under his canvas and felt the dew soak through his blanket. He rolled it, tied it, and checked the bolts on his racks before the first signal to start engines came down the line. He had lost count of how many round trips he had driven between the Seine and the Moselle. The map said hundreds of miles each way, but his memory measured the distance in the hours it took for the diesel to warm, the times he swapped tires, and the minutes he allowed himself to eat. The order board listed their current destination as a new dump forming near Metz, where Patton's tanks had reached the outer ring of German defenses built before the last war. The talk among drivers said that Metz was a fortress city with miles of concrete and guns in the hills, and that the Germans had vowed to hold it. Thompson cared only for the number on the manifest: 10,000 gallons per load. He had learned to ignore the rest because fear of what waited ahead did not change the job behind the wheel. When the convoy rolled, the air still held the smell of wood smoke from the villages. The road ran east through fields where white vapor rose from the low ground and hid the fences until the sun cleared. He felt the day settle on his shoulders with the old mix of tension and monotony that defined the work. A truck ahead dropped speed, and he pulled right to give space. The driver waved a wrench out the window to show a belt problem. Thompson eased to the shoulder and climbed down to help. 2 more men came back with spanners and 1 with a jack. They moved like men in a ritual they had repeated too many times. Within 10 minutes, the belt was fixed and the convoy moving again. No words, just nods. He watched the column pass, each truck with the same dust film, the same weary hands gripping the wheel, the same sense of small endurance. The battle that waited beyond their headlights was stretching into one of the slow, grinding struggles that armies meet when movement collides with geography. Metz stood on the Moselle in a bowl of rivers and hills lined with old fortifications. The city had been part of the German frontier system since the 19th century and had passed between nations twice in 70 years. When Third Army reached it in September 1944, the old forts that crowned the ridges were garrisoned by regular units reinforced by remnants of retreating divisions. The terrain favored defense. Rain began to fall more often. Flooded rivers and low clouds grounded Allied air cover. Bridges that had been patched for pursuit broke under the weight of constant crossings. The logistical rhythm that had driven the summer advance now shifted to a cycle of resupply and siege. Reports from the Red Ball Express showed wear on both men and machines. The average truck was logging 500 to 700 miles per week with minimal maintenance downtime. Tire failure rates rose by 30%. Of the original 6,000 trucks assigned, about 800 were off the line at any moment for repairs. Commanders called it mechanical attrition, a sterile phrase for what drivers saw as trucks bleeding out on the verge. Yet the system endured. New replacement vehicles arrived through the ports. Motor pools in the rear cannibalized wrecks to keep others running. The weather that slowed the advance also cooled the engines, allowing longer drives, without overheating. By late September, the Express still moved close to 10,000 tons daily, more than half of it fuel. Patton wrote that his army had enough to fight, but not enough to chase, that every shell fired and every tank mile driven was weighed against the gasoline needed to bring up the next. German intelligence reports intercepted that month confirmed what the men on both sides already knew. The American Army's true strength was not its armor or artillery, but its ability to keep its wheels turning. On a night run toward the Moselle crossings, Thompson found himself leading a shorter column, with orders to push through to a forward refueling point north of Toul. The rain had turned the road to black glass. He hunched over the wheel, staring at the faint red glow from the truck ahead. When lightning flashed, the landscape jumped out in white for a heartbeat, and he saw ruined barns and flooded fields. Somewhere to the north, guns were firing, the sound like slow thunder buried under the sky. He felt the wheel jerk as the tires hit a patch of slick mud where runoff had cut across the pavement. He slowed, shifted down, and held steady until the weight caught again. A truck 2 places behind him slid off and came to rest against a fence. The convoy halted while 2 jeeps came up with chains. They pulled the truck free, straightened the line, and rolled again. No one spoke much during such stops. Each man understood that delay was measured not in minutes, but in the fuel that tanks would not have in the morning. When they reached the dump before dawn, the ground crews had floodlights burning under tarpaulins and tankers waiting to refill. Thompson and his loader worked by routine. Unchain the racks, uncap the cans, stack and count. The hiss of fuel pouring from hoses into metal sounded like rain. He watched the men from ordnance units come with smaller trucks to carry the filled cans forward to armored columns that were already moving. He thought of the irony that the fuel he delivered would drive the same tanks that made the roads worse with their tracks. He drank coffee from a dented pot offered by one of the supply sergeants and leaned on the fender while the motor idled. The air smelled of gasoline, wet canvas, and cold iron. For a moment, he listened to the rhythm of the pumps and the low talk of men who had been awake too long and felt a strange calm. In that noise, he could almost believe the war was nothing but machines being fed. When his load sheet was signed, he climbed back into the cab and drove toward the west, the dawn spreading behind him like thin smoke. The scope of what those convoys achieved during that wet autumn can be measured in simple totals that filled the War Department's monthly bulletins. Between August and November 1944, the Red Ball Express moved more than 400,000 tons of supplies from Normandy to the forward armies. It consumed over 2 million gallons of fuel in its own operations, wore out more than 40,000 tires, and kept an average of 5,000 trucks on the road each day. The route's success allowed Third Army to maintain offensive pressure even while the rest of the Allied front rebalanced its logistics for the next phase. German commanders watching from the east noted with disbelief that even when bridges were lost or roads cratered, the American flow resumed within days. It was as if the entire country behind the lines was a single workshop devoted to keeping wheels in motion. Colonel Fritz Bayerlein, who commanded panzer divisions against Patton, wrote later that the American truck was more dangerous than the American tank because it never stopped. For the men like Thompson inside the cab, those words would have sounded like a distant echo of fatigue made visible. They did not think of themselves as symbols of an industrial miracle. They thought of miles and of the next load. They learned that endurance could be measured in the noise of an engine that started again each morning. As September turned to October and the clouds came lower, the roads hardened with frost at night, and the rivers began to show ice. The columns still rolled. The engines still burned fuel drawn from the tanks that Thompson and his crew had delivered. The campaign ahead would demand even more from the men behind the wheel, for the push to the Rhine was only beginning. By early October 1944, the roads east of Verdun turned slick with clay, and the light came later each morning. Sergeant James Thompson's convoy pulled out of a maintenance field near Bar-le-Duc before dawn, headlights shielded, engines low, the ground crunching under cold tires. The trucks rolled in pairs until the mist lifted enough for the column to stretch. He felt the familiar tremor in his chest that came before every long run. The Red Ball Express was entering its 7th week of constant movement, and men joked that the route would soon be paved with worn-out boots and engine parts. He had changed fan belts by lantern and patched tires in rain, and the truck itself had begun to feel like a living thing that demanded attention and repaid it with another hour of motion. The air was thin and cold, and the smell of the exhaust hung close to the ground. He thought about how far he had come since the beaches in July, and how the war had changed shape. It no longer felt like a chase, but like a siege of time and weather. The orders in his pocket listed a fuel load bound for a new forward depot near Thionville, north of Metz. The Germans were holding fast around the forts, and fuel consumption had shifted from long pursuits to short, violent pushes. The job was the same: load, drive, unload, repeat. He eased into gear, watched the road sign marked with a red circle, and followed the long curve east into another day. The siege of Metz had entered a bitter stage that autumn. The fortress city stood astride the Moselle and controlled key crossings toward the German frontier. Its ring of forts, some dating to the Franco-Prussian War, had survived bombardment and resisted repeated assaults. Patton's Third Army had encircled it by late September, but could not crack it easily. Heavy rains flooded approaches, turning fields into quagmires. Tanks bogged down in mud. Pontoon bridges collapsed under shell fire. The German garrison, numbering about 10,000 in the main defenses, fought with grim determination. For every shell that American guns fired, trucks like Thompson's delivered the powder and the propellant. The supply records for early October showed that the Red Ball Express moved an average of 9,000 tons per day, roughly half of it fuel. The remainder was ammunition, rations, and engineer stores, steel matting, timber, bridge components, all consumed by the siege. Commanders in the rear compared the operation to a self-feeding machine that could not pause without starving the armies. Every gallon moved forward kept the line alive. Patton's staff wrote that by mid-October, the fuel situation was critical again, with reserves near the front down to 2 days' supply. The general's anger filled the reports. He called for every truck that could roll, ordered mechanics to work without pause, and pressed the service corps to expand maintenance depots. Behind the fury lay the simple arithmetic of a modern army. One armored division in combat required about 60,000 gallons per day, and Metz consumed several divisions at once. Thompson reached the outskirts of Thionville in the gray light of morning and saw smoke rising from a rail yard where engineers had been working to reopen tracks. The town showed the scars of weeks of shelling. Roofs gone, walls cracked, trees stripped of bark. His convoy turned down a new bypass built by the engineers, and for the first time he saw tanks moving west, their hulls muddy and crews asleep on the turrets. The sight told him what no bulletin could. They were rotating exhausted units out of the line, which meant the front had stabilized for now. At the dump, he backed his truck onto planking laid over mud and waited while the fuel detail unchained the racks. He had learned to work fast and silent. The cans were unloaded, checked, and rolled toward the pumps that fed pipelines crawling toward the Moselle. When the last chain was clipped, he stood by the fender to stretch. The depot sergeant passed around mugs of coffee strong enough to lift the fog from their heads. A jeep pulled up carrying an officer from headquarters who spoke of the weather, of new orders, of hopes that the rail line from Nancy would soon relieve the trucks. Thompson listened without reaction. He had heard the same talk for weeks, rumors that the trucks would stand down, that new depots closer to the front would shorten runs. None of it ever changed the next dawn. When the orders came, he simply climbed back into the seat. That afternoon he drove west again, through villages where children waved from doorways and old men stood with folded arms watching the line of trucks vanish into mist. He felt an ache in his back that reached into his lungs and a dryness on his tongue that coffee could not cure. He had stopped trying to count miles or days. The road itself had become his measure of time. In the larger frame of the war, the slow struggle at Metz marked the transition between the summer of pursuit and the winter of endurance. The Allied front had stretched thin across France, its momentum checked by distance and exhaustion. The Red Ball Express, born as an improvisation, had grown into a logistical legend by necessity. By October, it had moved more than 300,000 tons since August and burned millions of gallons of fuel in the process. It was costly, inefficient by peacetime standards, yet indispensable. German commanders could not understand how an enemy could sustain such waste and still advance. The answer lay in the industrial depth behind those trucks. The refineries in Texas and Louisiana, the ship convoys across the Atlantic, the beach depots stacked with drums. It was a system without precedent, and its human engine was men like Thompson, who rarely saw beyond the next bend in the road but carried an empire's output on their axles. As November neared, the weather worsened, and the first snow fell on the hills around Metz. The forts finally surrendered one by one after continuous bombardment, and the city was declared secure on November 22nd. The victory came not only from guns, but from the relentless supply that never stopped, no matter how wet, how cold, or how tired the men became. Thompson drove through the ruins of Metz a few days later, the road littered with empty shell cases and twisted rails. He saw the cathedral still standing, blackened but whole. He parked his truck near a square where engineers were clearing debris, and for a rare moment allowed himself to feel the weight of it. The months of driving, the miles of road, the fuel that had kept an army moving. He did not think of glory or strategy. He thought of the simple act of arriving. The road ahead would lead toward the Rhine, and he knew he would be on it.